Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar discussing the weight of stress and depression, psychological factors, and weight control among Black women. I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the Council on Black Health, formerly known as the African American Collaborative Obesity Research Network, and the Center for Diabetes Translation Research at Washington University, St. Louis, for your participation this afternoon and interest in this topic. During the presentation today, we ask that you post questions using the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar interface. We will review and select questions for our presenter to respond to after the presentation. If your question was not selected for response, we will share follow-up feedback after today's session. Please feel free to also use the chat window and interact with fellow attendees during the session this afternoon. Today's presentation will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will publish the webinar online and share the link via email. Today's session will discuss Black women's higher prevalence of obesity compared to any other major demographic group in the United States. Additionally, Black women tend to lose less weight than their white counterparts when engaging in obesity treatment, regardless of modality. Reasons for differences in obesity prevalence and weight loss outcomes are not fully understood and warrant further exploration. This presentation will explore psychological factors that are associated with weight management among Black women in the Deep South, with a particular focus on the roles of stress and depression in obesity and obesity-related health outcomes. My name is Sheldon Oliver Watts, and I will be your moderator today. I am the National Director of the Council on Black Health, also known as the Council. The Council is the new identity for the African American Collaborative Obesity Research Network, a collaborative network of scholars and community-based research partners located in over 20 different states. The Council's mission is to develop and promote solutions that achieve healthy Black communities. Our national office is located at Drexel University's Dornsife School of Public Health in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The Council leverages the credibility and perspectives of Black American researchers and research partners to facilitate more relevant, community-engaged, high-impact, actionable solutions that positively impact Black communities. I'm also the core manager of the Solutions to Diabetes in Black Americans Core at Washington University's Center for Diabetes and Translation Research. As a Disparities Core, we provide methodological and content expertise to develop innovative approaches that advance the field of diabetes research in Black Americans. Our respected speaker today is Dr. Tiffany L. Carson. Dr. Carson is an assistant professor in the Division of Preventative Medicine in the Department of Medicine at the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Medicine. She is also an associate scientist in the UAB Nutrition Obesity Research Center, the Comprehensive Cancer Center, and the Minority Health and Health Disparities Research Center. Dr. Carson is an applied epidemiologist with expertise in the area of psychosocial factors related to obesity, such as stress, social support, body image, and quality of life. Dr. Carson's current research also incorporates biological measures into her investigations to inform a biobehavioral modal for addressing obesity and other health disparities. She has received funding from a National Cancer Institute Diversity Supplement, additional pilot grant programs, and an NCI-funded K01 award to examine the complex relationships between biological factors such as cortisol and gut microbiota and behavioral factors such as stress and stress coping, dietary factors, and their effects on weight and weight loss among Black and white women and men living in the Deep South. Dr. Carson has published in the areas of obesity, diet, physical activity, stress, and other psychosocial factors related to obesity in Black women. Dr. Carson, I invite you to proceed.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the Council on Black Health for inviting me to participate in this webinar series. I really appreciate this opportunity to use this platform to discuss this important topic with a larger audience. I was asked to talk about stress, depression, and body weight among Black women with a particular focus on Black women in the Deep South. And these psychological components of health are often under-discussed as it relates to health for Black women. So I look forward to great discussion today. So for today's talk, I will spend the next several minutes reviewing the epidemiology of obesity, followed by defining stress, Then I'll take a little time to discuss what is known about the relationship between stress and weight, both observationally as well as in the context of behavioral weight loss interventions. And this will also include some of the work that I've had the good fortune to be involved in over the past several years. And then to conclude, I'll briefly delve into some of the psychological and physiological impacts of stress. And that should leave us with plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. So here we have the CDC map that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, illustrating the prevalence of self-reported obesity among U.S. adults across the states, with the darker colors representing the areas with highest obesity prevalence. According to this data, about 40% of adults are affected with obesity. And we also know that obesity is not evenly distributed. It varies by geography and ethnicity and race and sex. So as you can see from this map, in the southeastern region, and many of these states comprise what is kind of known as the Deep South, this is the area that appears to be most affected with obesity. And in Alabama, where my current university is located and where I've conducted a lot of this work, the prevalence is consistently greater than 35%. We consistently rank in the top 3 or bottom 3, depending on how you look at it nationally in terms of obesity prevalence. We also observe geographic differences when we do rural-urban comparisons as well. So this next map slices the data a little bit differently. It shows the prevalence of self-reported obesity among non-Hispanic Black adults in the U.S. Now, as you can see, in essentially the entire eastern half of the country, more than 35% of Blacks have obesity. And when we include overweight and focus on women specifically, data suggests that 4 in 5 Black women have overweight or obesity. And we also know that Black women suffer a disproportionate burden of morbidity and mortality in obesity-related diseases like type 2 diabetes. So when talking about weight management among Black women, there are a couple of things that we must consider. So it's really a multi-pronged challenge that we are facing here. Data has shown that Black women have a higher prevalence of obesity than any other major demographic group in the country. But, you know, you also add on to that Black women lose less weight when attempting weight loss. And that's true through a variety of different treatment modalities. It's true for behavioral, pharmacologic, and surgical treatment approaches. And the reasons for this really still are not fully understood, but certainly suggest that there's additional work needed in this area to improve weight management among Black women. So obesity is complicated. I think any of us who work in that space kind of know and get that. There are a lot of contributors to obesity and a number of factors that play a role in weight management. So this infographic was presented at the annual meeting of the Obesity Society back in 2015, and it really aimed to list and organize all of the different potential contributors to obesity, either by impacting increased energy intake or decreased expenditure, or both. Now, contributors are also organized based on whether they happen inside the person, so those are the things on the left and tend to be more physiologic in nature, or outside the person, and those things tend to be more social, psychological, and environmental influences on energy storage. And since we know that race is a social construct, not a biological construct, we might expect that many of the things that drive racial disparities in health, and in this case, obesity, are things that are happening on the right side of this infographic. Now, even if we just look at half of it, we can certainly see that there are a lot of factors to consider here, but for the purpose of today's talk, we'll focus on stress. So stress has been defined as an uncomfortable emotional experience accompanied by biochemical, physiological, and behavioral changes. But I want to be clear to note here that stress is not inherently bad. In fact, the body's response to stress is really a survival mechanism in a lot of ways. It helps the brain or other organs to know how to react to overcome a potential threat or a stressful situation. However, it's this prolonged exposure to stress that really becomes problematic. We tend to think of stress in two types. So there's acute stress, and that's usually linked to a specific event and has a fixed time duration. So an example of that would be for an individual who doesn't like public speaking, right before they get up to do a talk in front of a large audience, they may feel some responses to that acute stressor. However, after the talk is completed, the stressor is over and things kind of go back to a baseline normal for that situation. Then there's chronic stress. Now, it's this type of stress that's characterized by repeated exposure to situations that lead to the release of stress hormones that has been linked to adverse health. This might include ongoing financial stress or relational stress, or even stress related to discrimination. Some stress researchers have characterized stressful events into a few large categories that you see here listed on this slide. There are major life events, so that would be something like the loss of a loved one or exposure to violence or a natural disaster that has happened really any time in your life. But also a major life event that could be a stressor could still be something positive. So we tend to think of these things as negative, but planning a wedding or starting a job or moving into a new home can also be stressors depending on how they're occurring and perceived in life. Recent events are things that really focus on changes in the past year. Now, this might include some of the things that were in the previous category, but may also be a more recent new occurrence, like relationship difficulties or an increased responsibility in job responsibilities that lead to increased stress. Another category is life trauma, and this usually refers to things like childhood trauma or neglect or abuse. And then the last category is just perceived chronic stress. And this really includes ongoing stress that could be related to any of the things mentioned before in the other categories, but the really defining characteristic is that it's associated with persistence. Again, it's important to note that how an individual perceives an event and the importance that one assigns to the stressor really defines whether or not that individual experiences stress as a result of the exposure. And we can't really talk about stress among Black women without recognizing this cultural norm for Black women to exude strength no matter what. This includes coping to meet daily demands and often having multiple caregiver roles. Scholars have certainly coined this term at this point. Some literature refers to it as the sojourner syndrome, and then there's the superwoman schema developed by Dr. Cheryl Woods-Giscombe. And these are really concepts that are used to explain the commonly observed onset of morbidity among Black women in response to persistent chronic stress and the coping mechanisms that are often utilized. And to further illustrate how the health of Black women may be particularly vulnerable to stress, we should also consider the challenges that this demographic group may experience because they exist at the intersection of two groups that have been historically discriminated against. So this intersectionality increases the likelihood that Black women will experience discrimination either due to race or sex, in some cases even both. And we have research that shows that discrimination is associated with increased stress, increased depression, and increased adiposity, both directly and through mechanisms of stress and depression. So in doing this work and thinking about how stress may impact health, it's very important that we clearly define the sources and forms of stress so that our focus can be on stressors that are prevalent to our community of focus. So now that we've reviewed the data on obesity and defined stress, we'll move forward by kind of bringing the two topics together. So I think we can all anecdotally think of individuals whose body weights respond differently to stress. In some people, we tend to see weight gain. In others, we tend to see weight loss when dealing with persistent stress. So here we'll just spend a few minutes exploring what is known from the data. So one of the first large cohort studies in the U.S. to examine the relationship between psychosocial stress and weight was published in 2009 in the American Journal of Epidemiology, and it was the Midlife in the United States study. Now, this study included a nationally representative cohort of adults aged 25 to 74. They utilized a telephone survey to assess psychosocial factors that influence physical and mental health for adults in midlife. This study included a focus on stress related specifically to work, personal relationships, life constraints, and finances over a 9-year period. The cohort included 1,355 participants. Of those, over half were female, and of females, about 10% were Black. Now, this study focused primarily on gendered comparisons, so we really can't glean much about racial subgroups from this analysis. However, the researchers did find that women had higher levels of baseline stress than men. Another interesting and kind of important finding is that baseline stress was associated with weight gain over time only among participants with higher BMIs at baseline, and this is true for men and women. So among individuals with lower BMIs, there really was not an association between stress and weight gain. They also saw that the relationship between stress and weight gain existed across more domains of stress for women compared to men. So as you can recall or see on the slide, stressors are defined into multiple categories. And for men, the relationships between stress and weight only existed as it related to stress from work and finances. Whereas for women, the relationship still persisted across stress domains related to relationships and life constraints. So since that initial study, there have been several additional observational studies that published reports on associations between stress and weight. When looking at individual studies, the findings are certainly mixed and have been inconsistent in some cases. But there are a couple of nice papers that have attempted to synthesize the findings thus far. So there was a meta-analysis conducted by Jane Wardle and colleagues back in 2011, published in Obesity. It included 14 studies on the association between stress and weight gain observationally. So this means with no intervention, just looking at people over time, is there an association between stress and weight gain? Again, when looking at individual studies, there were mixed findings. However, from the meta-analysis where all of the data were compiled into one larger analytic process, they concluded that psychosocial stress is a risk factor for weight gain, but effects are very small. They also saw more positive relationships than negative in studies where there was an effect, meaning that in more cases than not, increased stress was associated with weight gain as opposed to weight loss. Another more recent paper published in Obesity Reviews did a similar thing to review the more recent reports in this area. So this paper included 12 new reports. It drew conclusions similar to that of Wardle and colleagues that there is an association between stress and weight gain. This paper also went further to discuss that the higher risk for stress-related weight gain is due to multiple physiologic and behavioral processes that are really related to the activation of the HPA axis, the sympathetic nervous system, and negative affect, which is linked to emotional eating and other weight-related behaviors. So from those previous reports, we may conclude for now that stress is associated with at least modest weight gain over time in the free living population. Keep in mind that these were observational studies with no weight-focused intervention. So for the next step, I wanted to look at data about whether or not stress is associated with weight loss among participants in a behavioral weight loss program. Now, one of the first studies really looking at this among a racially diverse U.S. population is reported by Kim et al. In a 2009 publication in Health Psychology. Now, in this study, they examined whether baseline stress was associated with weight loss outcomes among a sample of overweight women with type 2 diabetes who were participating in a 6-month behavioral weight loss program. Stress was measured for this study using the perceived stress scale. This is a common and validated measure commonly used in research settings to assess perceived global stress. In this study, they reported that baseline stress was inversely associated with weight loss, meaning that higher baseline stress was associated with less weight loss at 6 months. And here you have a figure from the paper illustrating this same relationship when stress level was categorized into tertiles. So as you can see, participants in the highest stress category, and this was indicated by a score of 22 or greater, lost about 2 kilograms less than those in the lower stress category. And this difference was statistically significant. They also conducted sensitivity analyses to compare program completers to dropouts and saw that higher stress was reported among dropouts compared to completers. And so given what we already know about the behavioral weight loss literature as it relates to adherence and attendance being linked to outcomes, it's really important to just recognize this role of stress and participation. This isn't really the only study to support this association, but again, with this intervention literature across individual studies, there are also some cases where no association has been identified. Now, the reasons for this, again, would probably take a longer discussion than what we have time for on the phone today, but reasons could certainly range from things related to different measurement approaches to just differences in the population. So those are some things that we also have to think about when reviewing the stress literature and planning our future work in that area. Our research team wanted to examine a similar question in an exclusively Black sample of females in a behavioral weight loss program. So using data that we collected as a part of a larger study, we were able to explore the relationship between stress and weight outcomes. I'll briefly give you a little background about the main study and outcomes, but I'll mostly focus on our secondary analysis that really focused on the psychosocial measures. So the main study was a 2-year cluster randomized trial led by Dr. Monica Baskin. In this study, 409 women across 8 counties in Alabama and Mississippi were randomized at the county level to receive either a 24-month behavioral weight loss program augmented with support for community strategies to promote healthy living, or the same behavioral weight loss program only. To be eligible, participants had to work, live, or worship in one of our research counties, self-report as Black female, be between the ages of 30 and 70, and have overweight or obesity. Now, in addition to the multi-level approach of incorporating support for community strategies, the other really unique element of this intervention was that all sessions were led by trained lay community health advisors. So that also has implications in terms of just sustainability for future work. So here we have a table that kind of describes the study sample. Participants were in their mid-40s. Over 60% of participants reported a total annual household income of $30,000 or less, despite seeing a similar proportion reporting some education beyond high school. And I always point that out because we commonly see this lack of linearity between education and income in our work with these rural and underserved populations. So that's another point of consideration when working with these underserved communities and understanding what appropriate measures of socioeconomic status may be. Also, just over half of participants reported being single in this sample. So the main results paper reporting on the weight loss and change in metabolic markers at 6 months is published in the Journal of Internal Medicine if anyone wants to take a peek and get more details. In brief, the average participant weight loss was about 3 kilograms at 6 months. We were encouraged by this. This weight loss is comparable to what has been achieved in other translation studies for Black women in local communities. And our delivery by lay community members kind of suggests that there may be a viable model for future work. We also looked at losses of 3 and 5% body weight due to evidence that these amounts are clinically meaningful. And we saw that nearly 40% of participants lost lost at least 3% of their baseline body weight, and about a quarter lost at least 5% of baseline body weight. So as part of the secondary analyses, we wanted to look at stress specifically. Now in this sample, with our preliminary analyses, we did not observe a direct association between baseline stress and weight loss outcomes. In doing this, we also included depression measures as an exploratory question and saw no association between baseline depression and weight loss either. What we did observe, however, was that greater improvements in depression over time were associated with greater weight loss outcomes. And so this led to a little bit more thinking about examining these potential mechanisms and pathways really linking psychological and behavioral measures with weight loss outcomes. So we took some of the data that we had, did a little bit more discussion and digging into the literature about this topic, and decided to go forward doing a path analysis in which we would test whether baseline stress, as assessed with the perceived stress scale, was associated with 6-month BMI through either the indirect pathway of depressive symptoms or the indirect pathway of diet. Depressive symptoms was measured using the CESD-10, again, another commonly used validated measure for diverse populations in research. And then the dietary variable was a composite score that was created based on the intake of highly palatable foods that have been associated with stress. So these are going to be foods that are high in sugar, fat, or salt. And so here we have a quick summary of the variables included in the analysis. The perceived stress measure, so the exposure variable here, the mean score was 14. Although that number is not diagnostic, anything over 13 is generally considered high stress. The average score for depressive symptoms was 7. Anything over 10 is considered depressed. And the BMI at 6 months was 37.5. So the paper reporting these outcomes is currently under review, but here's a little sneak peek of what we found and presented some of this data at a meeting last year. So we controlled for a number of variables that are listed here on the slides, and we came up with the following standardized estimates. So first, we had evidence of good model fit with 18.7% of the variance in 6-month BMI being explained by this model. Now with this first pathway across the bottom, we saw that perceived stress at baseline was significantly associated with depressive symptoms at 6 months, which in turn was associated with BMI at 6 months. So further testing for an indirect effect did indicate a significant effect of perceived stress on BMI by way of depressive symptoms. In fact, we saw that 85% of this relationship was mediated by depressive symptoms. There was not a significant association between baseline stress and our dietary composite score. So as you would expect, there would not be an indirect pathway here either. And we've really been thinking about this question about how stress affects participation in behavioral weight loss programs for a while. In 2011, we published a paper from a worksite behavioral weight loss program for women in a predominantly Black worksite in Birmingham, Alabama. So this was a 30-week program led by Dr. Jamie Ard. It was a cultural adaptation of the Eat Right Weight Management Program, which is the clinical obesity treatment program here at UAB. And for this study, while weight change was the primary outcome of focus, we were really struck by our observation of what seemed like a high number of life stressors in a relatively short period of time. So this wasn't something that we systematically collected as a part of the original study, but based on just these anecdotal observations, we decided to investigate the role of stress further. After the study was completed, we conducted semi-structured interviews with a representative sample of participants to really try to learn more about how the stressors affected their participation in the weight loss program. Among those who lost weight, they talked a lot about how stress those who lost less weight talked about how stress really didn't allow them to fully engage in the program and that their life events really took priority over weight loss. However, among those who lost more weight, they noted how they were able to use strategies that they learned as a part of the weight loss intervention to better manage their stress. So this really led to a question of whether or not there was a way to take that opportunity to create some synergy in behavioral interventions that might lead to improved stress management and weight management. And the question specifically is, can adding a strong stress management component to a behavioral weight loss program improve weight loss outcomes? Now, according to the 2018 paper in Obesity Reviews that I mentioned before, really only 2 small pilot studies have explored this question. One of the studies did demonstrate improved outcomes with stress management. The findings were statistically significant, and the population was a sample of Greek women. Now, the second paper focused exclusively on a sample of Black women. We saw trends, although not statistically significant, and this was actually a paper that I led with some other collaborators. And so I will actually share some of those study details with you now. The study was known as RENEW. It was a pilot feasibility study led by Dr. Delia Smith-West. The study enrolled 44 participants who met the criteria listed to the left of the screen. Participants were Black females with elevated stress levels, and this was based upon just a screening survey at study entry. They were 25 to 45 years old and had to have a BMI of at least 25. These participants were randomized to one of 2 treatment conditions. The active intervention was a 12-week DPP-based behavioral weight loss program, so the diabetes prevention program, plus systematic strategies for stress management. The comparison group was the behavioral weight loss intervention alone. So here's a very brief description of the intervention components that were common to both arms. Both consisted of 60-minute sessions with Black master's level trained counselors to have race concordance. Participants were given fat and calorie goals based on their starting weights to promote 3 to 5% weight loss. Everyone was advised to increase their moderate physical activity with an eventual goal of 200 minutes per week. And self-monitoring was really a vital component for both groups as well. Participants were advised to journal their food intake weekly, and they submitted it to the group leader, who provided reviews and feedback at the following meetings. Now, in addition to these components, those randomized to the Lifestyle Plus Stress group received training in stress management strategies. So these included relaxation techniques like guided relaxation, diaphragmatic breathing, and mindfulness. They were also trained in behavioral strategies for stress management. So these are things like better time management or distractions, so finding something to take your mind off of the stressor. And then they were also trained with cognitive approaches for stress management, including things like challenging dichotomous thinking and utilizing positive self-statements and affirmations. The primary outcome of this study was change in body weight. We were also interested in looking at changes in stress as measured by the perceived stress scale. And we also collected saliva so we could have an objective measure of stress in the form of salivary cortisol. And then finally, we wanted to look at any group assignment effects on attendance and self-monitoring. Here we have a description of the study sample. Participants were about 44 years old on average and had class 2 obesity. Our participants were also fairly well educated, and there were no significant differences by group. So this table shows the results of our predetermined outcomes. While the groups didn't really display any significant differences in outcomes, which may very much be a function of just a small, underpowered sample size, we were definitely encouraged by a couple of trends that we saw, as this was a pilot feasibility study. For example, participants in the lifestyle plus stress group lost about twice as much weight as those in the lifestyle only group. We really didn't see any differences in the perceived stress scale scores from the survey. However, we did see a trend towards greater reduction in cortisol among those who received the additional stress management training. There were not any group differences in our adherence measures by group, as displayed here. But this work was really encouraging for us in terms of the potential to really improve weight loss outcomes by addressing stress among highly stressed individuals. So for the last few minutes of this webinar, I want to shift gears a little bit. We spent most of our time really talking about behavioral elements, but I do want to talk just a little bit about biologic components. We experience these external stressors, these external stimuli, and we have to think about how do those experiences or exposures actually get under our skin to affect health. So how does stress enter the body? And so at a very high level, I'll kind of go over this physiology of stress. The stress response is mostly regulated by the HPA axis. This is really the primary neuroendocrine highway where our body receives stress signals through our senses, and then the brain interprets and converts them into chemical messengers. And these compounds are delivered to the proper organ to lead to the action to overcome the stress. So they may keep the brain on high alert and ready, or may stimulate the heart to pump more blood in times of threat or while experiencing stress. But as you can imagine, while that may work well in acute situations, prolonged exposures to stress can really lead to dysregulation of this system, and that can ultimately lead to inflammation, poor metabolism, and a number of other biological changes that lead to adverse health. The most common hormone that we usually assess in response to stress is cortisol, and that's released in this pathway. But researchers are also starting to explore the impact of stress on other physiologic processes that may lead to morbidity. There's a lot of work coming out of UCSF looking at the role of stress on telomeres and how that affects our actual biological age. Another area gaining attention here is the role of stress in the gut microbiota, and that's some of the work that I do here. So in the last few minutes, I'll share a little bit about what we've done so far in this space. So just to briefly review, we've heard a lot about the microbiome or the microbiota. It's even on TV commercials now as a part of advertisements for products. But I do want to do a little bit to clarify what the terms mean. The term microbiota really refers to the community of bacteria that inhabit an area. In our gut microbiota research, that's the niche area that we are focused on. The microbiome actually describes the complete genome of the microbiota, and then when you hear microbe, that really just refers to individual bacteria. The gut microbiota has been linked to multiple diseases, including a couple in our areas of focus, obesity and obesity-related diseases like some cancers, and there's even some early evidence that relates to type 2 diabetes. The gut microbiota is really influenced by a number of different factors. So we have good evidence that it's influenced by mode of delivery at birth. It's highly influenced by diet, physical activity, medications, and environment. We also know that there may be a potential target here for preventive or therapeutic treatment for multiple conditions. So while we know a lot of things that influence the gut microbiota, there's still a lot of learning going on in this space. And as I mentioned, one growing area of interest is the role of stress in the gut microbiota. So our team wanted to look at this question, first of all, of whether or not there are racial differences in the gut microbial composition that may contribute to health disparities. And then if so, are those differences possibly attributable to differences in dietary patterns or differences in stress levels. So to explore these questions, we secured a pilot grant and enrolled 100 generally healthy women to provide data and samples. To complete this work, it definitely takes a multidisciplinary team of behavioral scientists and basic scientists, biostatisticians, bioinformaticians, just a large team science effort to really start to do this type of work. So for this study, participants had to be at least 19 years old, identify as a non-Hispanic, Black or white female, and have no major medical conditions, also with no antibiotic use in the previous 3 months due to the effects on the gut bacteria. We collected a number of biospecimen samples, so stool, saliva, and blood. We also collected demographic information, anthropometrics, and measures of diet and stress. Here's a quick description of our participants. As you can see, Black women were older and had an average higher BMI than our white participants. Interestingly, and contrary to what we've seen in our studies before and what's commonly seen in the literature, for this particular sample, white women reported higher scores on the weekly stress inventory, which really assesses the number of and impact of acute stressors in the previous week. There were no differences in the perceived stress scale, which looks at more global chronic stress over time. We also didn't see significant differences in some of the dietary factors of focus, such as fiber and fat, due to their relationship with the gut microbiota, according to current literature. So here we have the outcomes of the microbiota analysis, and I'll walk through this since it's maybe not familiar to people who don't typically work in this space. This table to the top left of the slide shows 5 different tests of alpha diversity. And alpha diversity really just refers to the number of different types of bugs in the gut, and generally higher diversity is associated with better health. So based on these tests, we really did not see any racial differences in alpha diversity when comparing Black and white females. Now, when we looked at beta diversity, and this essentially compares 2 groups to look at similarity in the distribution of bugs in the gut, we did see significant differences. This PICO-8 plot kind of also illustrates this point. So with this plot, microbial profiles that are more similar to one another tend to cluster together. And as you can see, white participants, indicated by this sort of turquoise color, are more tightly clustered here, where Black participants tend to be more dispersed, suggesting that these white participants are more similar to one another than the Black participants. We also saw that stress, as measured by the perceived stress scale, was associated with several different bacterial groups. This is consistent with what has been seen in animal studies looking at the effect of stress on the gut microbiota. So we are currently conducting additional work to kind of really start to further understand what these preliminary findings may mean for humans and what the potential is to improve health and outcomes going forward. So to kind of summarize what I presented today, studies certainly suggest that stress is associated with modest weight gain over time, and that poor outcomes among behavioral weight loss participants and interventions may also be associated with stress. And this is likely the result of behavioral and physiologic responses to stress. Black women do typically report higher chronic stress, which may contribute to the weight trends observed for this group. In some, stress may also lead to depression, which is associated with weight gain. And so keeping these things in mind, the integration of focused stress management into current evidence-based behavioral weight loss trials may indeed lead to improved outcomes, particularly when we focus on participants exhibiting high stress at baseline. So that really concludes what I had prepared for today's presentation. I thank you for your attention, and I think we should have time left for questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Carson, for the presentation this afternoon. What I'd like to do now is invite our attendees to post any questions they have using the Q&A button in the Zoom webinar interface, and I'll present those questions to Dr. Carson for rebuttal. Okay, so I have a first question that seems to be an overarching question, and it is, can you discuss some of the behavioral factors that may contribute to weight gain in populations experiencing higher amounts of stress, with any specific considerations for Black women?
Sure. So some of what we've seen is that individuals with higher stress, and particularly those who already have higher BMIs, tend to engage in emotional eating as a coping mechanism. And emotional eating is often of things that are associated with increased weight gain. So these are foods that are high in sugar, high in fat, and oftentimes high in salt as well, which may contribute to other adverse health effects. Also, increased stress has been shown to be associated with lower physical activity. So if you consider that a person who's higher stressed will tend to eat foods that are higher in calories and expend less energy, you know, the energy balance is off there, and you would be in positive energy balance, which would lead to weight gain. I think the other thing is, for those who are seeking treatment, you know, life happens, and these stressors in many cases tend to take priority over, you know, a weight loss program or weight loss efforts. If people's stressors are associated, for example, with financial insecurities, then you can imagine that there may be a complex kind of multi-level issue going on there, because there may be things related to food insecurity, which is also associated to poor dietary habits. And, you know, given the correlations that we know between race and income in the country, we can see particularly how things like that might be even more problematic for Black women.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another question that I think goes back to one of your earlier slides, talking about some of this variation in a Black female population. And this question is, how can we as public health professionals combat the cultural notion of the sojourner syndrome, or the idea of a Black woman being superwomen? What might be some effective strategies or approaches to use?
And I think that's a great question, because it's not a new issue. Even though we have our new kind of scholarly names for them, this is something that has persisted for generations. I think, you know, the messaging that is starting to gain more traction now about promoting mental health, about removing stigma from mental health, about promoting self-care and reminding people that you can't take care of everyone unless you take care of yourself. These are the kinds of messages and campaigns that hopefully can start to shift the expectation and shift the narrative. And there has to be, you know, some kind of specific, focused, tailoring efforts towards Black women who certainly kind of encounter this at a disproportionate level. I do think some efforts are being made in that space in terms of removing stigma from mental health and stressing the importance of self-care. But there's certainly a lot of work that remains to be done there.
And I definitely see how that intervention that you discussed, where was a tailored piece where you all added the stress management component, the dietary intervention, how integrating or incorporating some of these characteristics that would be specifically tailored to this, you know, syndrome or this experience for Black women would be a perfect way of tailoring an intervention to really address some of these specific issues.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Oh, no, this was just a remark as it related to that earlier intervention that you discussed.
Oh,
The dietary intervention, where one of the groups had a stress management component added to it.
Mhm.
And I could see how tailoring an intervention to incorporate some of the characteristics that are specific to Black women as it relates to the Sojourner syndrome being an interesting perspective or interesting spin on that type of an intervention. Tailoring it
Yeah,
to
absolutely. I totally agree, and we kind of have some plans to do just that going forward. So, with the pilot work, it was certainly just to get a preliminary understanding and understand the feasibility by just incorporating some of these general kind of evidence-based stress management strategies, period. But as we thought about how to even enhance it more, particularly among our population of interest, we certainly feel like the next version of this needs to be tailored and focused on things that are of relevance as it relates to Black women and stress. And I think you hit it spot on with noting that, this cultural norm of, the always being the strong person no matter what is detrimental to health. And so we have to include some of that in it as well. I absolutely agree.
It reminds me of an earlier webinar that we had. I believe Dr. Griffith presented not too long ago. It was either Dr. Griffith or Jamie Ard, and he was talking about obesity and obesity management. And a part of it was looking at John Henryanism and how that was a unique factor for African American men, for Black men, in terms of their risk for disease. And similarly, I see the parallels in terms of the Sojourner syndrome and risk for Black women.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's, if I'm not mistaken, I think there's actually more of a measure now of at least the Superwoman schema to kind of give us the opportunity to measure this and quantify it so that we can really look at how it's associated with outcomes. So I think that'll be an exciting part of this next phase of research as well.
Certainly. Okay, so we have another question. The person remarked that I may have missed this, but do you know if having a high weight level is a source of stress apart from other stressors, and does this vary by race?
Whether having a higher weight level is a source of stress?
Is a source of stress apart from other stressors?
So there is some literature that kind of suggests that there is this cyclical relationship between higher BMIs and stress. So certainly BMI and being overweight or having obesity has been shown to be associated with stress. But again, it's kind of cyclical and feeds into one another. And that is true independent of other stressors. I'm not completely sure if I've seen anything that really stratifies it by race, but I do think that that's a great question, especially given what we know about differences in cultural norms for body sizes, particularly as it relates to women. So I do think that's a great question.
And we do know that there's variation in terms of perceptions of body size by race. So it may be more of an issue for certain populations than it is for others. Exactly.
We have a fairly robust literature supporting that. There's more pressure to be thin among white women compared to Black women, and that, although there may be some desire to be thinner among Black women, there's also greater acceptance of larger and curvier body sizes. So you would certainly think that that kind of contributes to some of the psychology of weight management too.
I think that's it for our questions. I'm holding on for a moment more to see if anyone else wanted to post a question this afternoon, but we're just about on the hour's mark. So I think if I don't see anything shortly, we'll go ahead and close out today. So what we have on the screen here are the references from your presentation, Dr. Carson. I'm not sure if you'd like to give any commentary on these as we page through these before we close out today's webinar.
Really just to close out, I think, for people who are interested in this space, these are certainly some of the seminal works in this area. We have included the publications related to the Sojourner Syndrome and Superwoman Schema. The other thing that was actually kind of nice in compiling this and preparing for this webinar is that a lot of the work that was cited today is actually work generated by members of the Council on Black Health or friends of the Council. So there may certainly be some opportunities for people to connect and collaborate if there's shared interest in kind of going forward in this space. So certainly take a look at some of the listed references.
All right. Well, I would like to thank you very deeply, Dr. Carson, for this insightful presentation and perspective on the psychological factors in weight control among Black American women. I'd also like to thank our attendees for participating in the Solutions to Diabetes in Black Americans webinar, The Weight of Stress and Depression, Psychological Factors and Weight Control Among Black Women. We will share an evaluation survey and video of this webinar shortly. And I'd also like to thank you, Dr. Carson, for your time and for your effort this afternoon in making this presentation possible. And if you'd like to make any closing remarks.
No, it's my pleasure to be a part of it, and I thank everyone for joining us.
Wonderful. Everyone, please have a pleasant and safe afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.